Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television with me, Frank Pereira. Rising corporate debt and higher default rates have led to a continuous increase in distressed loans in the Indian financial system. The situation has worsened in the last 5 years, with the stressed asset ratio rising from 7.6% in March 2012 to 11.5% in March 2016. This accumulation of bad loans in the banking sector is not the doing of corporates alone. Poor credit appraisal, collateral-based lending, lack of corporate governance and accountability, and ambitious credit growth targets led to unwarranted lending by banks. Aiming to clean up stressed balance sheets of banks, by March 2017, the Reserve Bank of India mandated stricter provisioning requirements under asset quality review, which led to identification of elevated non-performing assets levels in the past 12 to 18 months. According to an RBI report, the stressed assets ratio stood at 12.2% at the end of June 2016, of which 8.6% of loans are gross non-performing assets and an additional 3.6% are restructured loans. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will discuss if bad loans and restructuring of loans are a product of corruption, and should Indian banks be more autonomous. Joining me on this edition of The Big Picture today are Renu Kohli, consultant ICRIA. She is also former staff member of the RBI and IMF. TK Arun, editor, Opinion, Economic Times. Ajay Dua, former secretary, Ministry of Commerce and Industry. US Bhargava, former chief GM, Punjab National Bank. Mr. Bhargava, I'd like to start with you, of course. What are the reasons behind rising NPAs?
Reasons are mixed. Some industries are genuinely suffering because of the market conditions. But then, as you have indicated, in some cases, maybe that the credit appraisal has not been good, or some influences have been exercised. Because of that, the problems are there. But the more important part probably will be the earliest possible resolution of the NPAs. For that, I think all concerned will have to be jointly make efforts, including the judiciary system, where a large number of cases are pending for resolution, and we were having expectation on every step taken for setting up the exclusive judiciary system for the banking loan cases like DRTs and WIFR and all that have not helped us in improving the position. And now, last year, that insolvency and bankruptcy code 2016 has been passed. And we expect that if early resolution of the cases is there, then probably a lot of the issues will be resolved. Because of the delays, many a times the assets are frittered away by the borrower concerned, and the banks are left high and dry, and they are not able to recover even the principal amount in many of the cases.
Indeed. TK Arun, this discussion comes in the wake of the former ex-CMD of IDBI being arrested just a couple of days ago, or yesterday in fact, on Monday is when he got arrested. How big a role does corruption really play in NPAs?
I think corruption does play a role, but it's not just corruption. Actually this corruption is not just at the level of the bank. Please understand, this is part of a system. We have a system of political financing which is done covertly, off the books, done by companies without showing the income they use to fund the political parties on their books, and political parties never reveal where they got their money from. So companies have to generate black money. A company in India, if it's listed, has no incentive to conceal income. The higher the income they report, the greater their valuation in the stock market, greater the net worth of the company and of the promoter, and the greater the ability to leverage that net worth and to raise more resources. So after the stock market boom in the 1990s, listed companies have no incentive to conceal income. However, companies have to generate money off the books. So typically, one way they do this is to actually, apart from over-invoicing, under-invoicing external trade, you can inflate project costs and get more money from the banks than is actually required for the project, and take the excess money out while implementing the project. And you have to do this because you have to generate the black money to fund the political parties. So to talk about just about the banks as if the bank chairman and their people are all corrupt, while excluding the systemic demand for unaccounted money by your political system, is actually not correct. So you have to clean up the entire system. to pick on one or two individuals and penalize them will neither cleanse the system nor bring any fundamental change, but will actually make the system worse. No bank chairman today will want to take any risk of taking a bad decision which will ultimately land him up in jail. So at a time when your total fixed capital formation as a proportion of GDP has dropped all the way down to 26.5% of GDP, the lowest since 2004-05, you do not want this. You want the system to work. You want people to lend money and step up investment and boost growth. So this, I think, is not a particularly helpful move either in terms of combating corruption or in terms of getting the economy moving.
Indeed. Mr. Dua, how do you cleanse the system, as T.K. Arun is pointing out?
Through structural changes in the way we run the banking system in the country. For far too long, the banking industry has been dominated in India by public sector banks. We made a beginning some years ago and by allowing private sector banks to come in, though we may have put shackles on their growth, particularly if they happen to be foreign banks. But we have seen there are clear differences in performance by whatever financial parameters or social parameters, even because so far we used to justify public sector banks that social parameters they do far better than others. I think there is a clear case that going forward, we've had 45 years or 46 years of nationalization. We must revisit this industry and see how efficiency can be brought in. And that takes me to the issues that unless we do that, going forward, I think our banks are going to be public sector banks are going to be shrinking rather than expanding, with NPAs of the order which you mentioned. I think the figures which you gave were probably of the banking system as a whole. Public sector is probably 1.5 to 1.6%, more than that. Their NPAs, and if we not only include structured, restructured loans, but if we were to also include where 30 to 60 days credit failure has been there, 60 to 90 days has been there, they call it MSA 1, MSA 2, those are actually heading towards the NPAs. Actually it's close to 13%. And the expectation is that by mid-year this year, it will be 13.5% of the advances of the of the public sector banks could go bad. How is it being financed today? Through some equity infusion from the government, highly inadequate, and at that kind of a, because the government can go only up to a point. It has so many other obligations to meet from the, and with these restrictions on fiscal deficit, etc. The way forward has to be found, and to my mind, it is allow this capitalization of the banks to take place through private infusion of funds rather than the government doing it. The moment, and that is necessary. Otherwise, we are not even going to be in compliance of what's called now the objective is Basel III norms, that there has to be so much of liquidity in this, which the banks must hold CRR and all kind of things have been prescribed. Under that kind of a scenario, I see need for strategic disinvestment taking place in the banking industry. People from within the country, outside, coming to invest here. The valuation, at one point of time, they were not willing to come because the valuations were unduly high. But with this exposure of 13-odd%, 12.5 or 13.5 soon to be, has brought the valuations down considerably. There would be interest, and I think there would be gains all around if we were to explore that.
Renu Kohli, Ajay Dua is bringing up the point of recapitalization. Is it the best time to recapitalize the banks at this point in time, because demonetization has just taken place and the banks are flush with cash?
Well, today is as good a time, or in fact it's a desperate need for something that should have happened actually maybe in 2013 and 14, because the banking system and its counterpart, the corporate balance sheets, both are overburdened by bad debts, and clearly that demands a resolution. Now the question is, what is the view of the government? Do they want to divest and follow the path as my panelist has just, Mr. Dua has recommended? If that is the issue, then there isn't any need to recapitalize. But then, if you want to retain them in the public sector, then obviously you've got to boost and strengthen their capital base and bring things back to normal so that normalcy can resume. Part of the reason, in fact, a major reason why investment is down and it's failing to revive is because of this. Because if you have a debt overhang, firms are not willing to invest, and neither are banks healthy enough to even look at new lending. So this is an issue which has to be given very serious. I would say it's the most important economic or policy issue at this point, and it was even 2 years ago.
Sure. Sure.
One thing. See, another structural reform required, apart from ownership and the decision-making process flowing from that ownership of the banks. There's a corporate debt market. You know, in India, all projects are funded by banks. Why? You know, long gestation projects should be funded, ideally, large infrastructure projects should be funded by corporate bonds. So unless you have a decent market for corporate bonds, you will have to rely on banks. And once banks take decisions on credit, then it is amenable to some kind of manipulation through political influence or through corruption or whatever. But you have a large number of players, rating agencies, brokerages, analysts, all kinds of people taking a view on the viability of a particular project because that project is trying to raise debt from the market, from investors. Then the decision-making process becomes far more transparent and subject to questioning. There it is less easy for people to inflate project costs and take money out of the project while implementation. So having a corporate debt market and not through a private placement, which again the banks will take, but having widely distributed subscription to corporate bonds, that is the way to go forward if you want to fundamentally tackle the way or the health of the banking system.
Yes,
you know, merely because term loans are available from banks hasn't come in the way of the corporate bond market developing in India. There are other reasons for it, plenty of other reasons, and we've been talking about it for a long time. What I think is, alongside the restructuring along what we've been talking about, we have to reckon with the fact that the economy is not doing very well. There would always be stressed assets, particularly in certain sectors which of late have seen considerable overcapacity, and I refer to the steel industry,
yes,
as well as the power industry. Despite the Uday scheme being there, we would have to certainly address the needs of those sectors separately. And there was a talk, if you will recall, Arun and Mr. Frank, that let's set up a bad loan. Government even talked about it. But yes, a bad bank, sorry. A bad bank, which will take away all these stressed assets.
Yeah.
But then the fear always was, then again these banks will become reckless. Others will start lending. So probably now the government is no longer talking about it. Separating the past problems from going forward would also need to be addressed, and the role of the government in looking at the past assets would need to be separated as they go forward.
Indeed.
Otherwise, you would find that even interest of private sector, private investors, both overseas and Indian, would wane, and they will then value the banks at much lower value than they have. And the biggest strength of our public sector banks, and I'll be very quick, is that they have a huge distribution network, which no private bank has it, and certainly not a foreign bank. So that has to be valued much more than the loans and advances sitting on there.
Indeed, the reach has to be valued
Absolutely.
much more, indeed. Mr. Bhargava, you know, as far as NPAs of the private sector banks are concerned, you know, private sector banks seem to be doing far better than the public sector banks. So is there a lesson for the public sector banks to be learning from the private sector banks?
Now, I'd like to make 2-3 observations. One is that as far as I understand, that the new private sector banks have hardly made much of advances to the corporate sector as compared to the public sector banks. In case we look at the total kitty of the advances made by the public sector banks to the corporate sector and to the retail borrowers, then we'll find that most of the advances by the private sector banks have gone for the retail loans. And therefore, I think it will be a little more time when we'll know what exactly is the difference between the processing of the loan cases at the private sector banks level and the public sector banks level. Because as far as the norms etc. are concerned, technology is concerned, all that is commonly available for both the public sector banks as well as the private sector banks. But as Mr. Arun was indicating, probably because of the structuring system prevailing at present in the public sector banks, where a lot of say is there by the government and the appointments etc. are made with the some purpose behind them, and unless that is changed, I think that processing etc. can very well be taken care of with the knowledge, technology and everything available commonly with both the public sector banks as well as the private sector banks. Then another point which was made was whether it is the right time to infuse the capital. I think it is most appropriate time to infuse the capital, because as was rightly said, after demonetization, the banks are flushed with the funds and they are only too eager to lend those funds available, because the banks are meant for that in case they are having the funds, they are there to be lent. But then for making fresh advances, the capital adequacy ratio is also required to be taken care of. And in case capital support is not there, the banks will not be able to lend the funds available with them. So it is most opportune time, whether the banks are able to generate their own funds or it is infused by the government. It needs to be done as fast as possible.
Yeah, I think that is very clear that it has to be, recapitalization has to be done at the earliest and as soon as possible. But Ms. Kohli, as far as the government itself is concerned, should the government be in the business of lending, be it through banks?
Government in the business of lending, on the face of it, it isn't in the business, except through, giving directives about, X 40% should be lent out to the priority sector, etc. But let me make just 2 points. One is that if you're just looking at the NPAs and connecting this to government interference via public sector banks, there is substantial merit in this, there's substance in that argument. But let's just look at the counterfactual. If we take the private sector banks as the counterfactual, they have high levels of NPAs too, and they are rising. So there's something systemic, there is something which has gone wrong in terms of reading of future demand at the time when investments took place and these financing took place. And so it is, I think, very rash to look at the whole issue of NPAs as just corruption and non-corruption, or public sector banks versus private sector banks. There are large public sector banks who have very high level of NPAs and whose slippage rates has accelerated in this year, which is somewhat different from what is happening at the public sector bank level of public sector banks. So the whole point is that, as far as public sector banks is concerned, I agree, and I've already said this before, as my other co-panelists have also said, that government should not be in the business of banking at all. It should be getting out altogether.
Yeah.
Now the question is, you want to do it gradually. In fact, since 1990, middle of the 90s, it has been happening gradually. Public sector banks were forced to list and there was divestment. But somehow that psychological threshold of 51%, which defines ownership, has just not, there's no political will for that.
Indeed. Yes, Mr. Dua, you want to make a point. And also another question is, should the Bank Nationalization Act of 1969, do we take a relook at that now?
Absolutely. I would answer that first before the economic situation, the social situation in the country in 1969 just was 22 years after independence, when we had got onto the planning process. I think the fourth plan was on at that point of time. Now we have moved post-1991 to a market-driven economy. There is absolutely need to look at the various regulations, laws, and those have to be in line with the current market situation. This is not to say that the government or the banks should not have a social role. Let the regulator do it. Regulator would deal with will interfere or regulate the private sector as much as the public sector. it's an even ground. But the moment we leave it to the government, and the government derives its powers largely from the Banking Nationalization Act, and the fact that a single joint secretary in charge of banking in 1969 got replaced over the years by a full-fledged banking department now called the Financial Services Department, is everybody has to remain occupied. So the best way is now keep breathing down the necks of these public sector banks and ask them to keep coming. They end up reporting to the RBI, they end up reporting to the government, and the government tells them, I have to answer the parliament on your behalf. So they become even more servile because they can't defend themselves and others. There is a need certainly to revisit the Act, give them greater autonomy, but having said that, that does not mean not strengthen regulations through the independent regulatory system of the RBI.
Indeed. Mr. Arun, complete autonomy or regulated autonomy? I mean, what is it that we'd like to prefer in the future?
No, there is a question of complete autonomy. Banks are handling the public savings, and there has to be mechanisms to ensure that these savings are mediated properly and the public savers do get a decent return on their savings. So they have to be regulated, and the level of regulation has been possibly inadequate. We are over-regulated and under-governed. This is a phrase from Manmohan Singh. So unless you create your policies right, your regulatory measures right, you will not be able to do this. I would just say one thing about this public ownership.
Sure.
Many people like to criticize Nehru as somebody who tried to build socialism and destroy the economy. Just the opposite. Under Nehru, the government of India set up term lending financial institutions who issued bonds which were made what I call SLR eligible. So banks are obliged to buy SLR bonds as part of their operating conditions, any bank. So these term lending institutions, when they issued bonds, they were subscribed to by the banks, which means the public savings, which went directly to banks, then got channeled to these term lending institutions, who in turn lend this money to India's private sector to build their factories, set up projects, and so on and so forth. So without the government playing this role, the Indian private sector would not have ready access to the Indian public savings. So the government sort of fashioned the mediatory mechanism for the public savings to reach industry. So it actually built up, the so-called socialist Nehru built up the industrial bases and provided them capital. So this is a vital role. But as Mr. Dua said, times change. The ability of the private sector to build banks has also evolved. Now ICICI is a bank that used to be a public sector institution, when became majority privately owned, and plays a stellar role in funding industry. There are some private sector banks which do not, as Mr. Bhargav said, do not fund real capital formation, don't take risk on lending to industry. ICICI does. Now there are some other new banks which are also doing pretty well, which meet industry's requirements and are still prudent about it. So the point is to have an incentive structure where the managers who take the credit decisions, they have transparent in their decisions and have incentives in place to ensure that they behave in the right fashion, which align their interests with the interests of savers whose money they are handling. It can be done. I mean, the world over people do this. Now, for this you need regulation, transparency norms, adequate capital requirements. Now, these Basel norms have now moved from mere having capital to what is called a loss absorbing capacity, which means that at times even the private savers' money can be bailed in by the banks as to augment their capital. They could issue specialized bonds which can serve like equity in times of crisis. In normal times you get a decent return on that bond, but if the bank is under risk of going under, these bonds might actually do the purpose of equity and will not get any return. So there are various ways in which you can actually capitalize banks. Government could even think of creating a holding company, and that holding company could raise money and then capitalize. So there are a variety of ways in which you can actually structure the capital, but capitalizing your banks has to be done.
Indeed, indeed, it has to be done. Let's take
that thing, the bankruptcy code, it must be fully activated, operationalized.
Sure. Mr. Bhargava, I'm going to ask you a difficult question now, since you're the chief GM of one of the nationalized banks. How much of government pressure or political pressure is there on banks really when you restructure some of these loans?
At times they definitely are there, but then in case of restructuring also, the consensus is required to be developed today with all the banks involved. And when the decision is required to be taken by a committee rather than an individual, then the things tend to become more transparent. Number two, I would also like to say that wherever the assets are stuck up, there the judiciary should initiate action for proper disposal of the assets at the earliest, because with the passage of time, either the owner is frittering them away or they are deteriorating, and after lapse of some time the assets no longer remain useful for anybody, and that is a loss to the economy as such. I personally know of an industry wherein completely new set of machineries for crores of rupees were put up, and after 3 months the company stopped working, and the machineries were not put to use for next 10 years, and they became just junk. So whatever assets are created, there has to be a mechanism that in case the existing promoters are not able to put them to proper use, the alternate use is made possible as early as possible.
Okay, fine.
That's what the bankruptcy and insolvency code
And in respect of this, in respect of autonomy also, I would like to say,
sure, quickly,
that within broad contours, the banks should be permitted to have their own business plans, and that too should be taken care of by looking into the technology today available, because as was being discussed in 1969 the banks were nationalized, and thereafter the branch expansion was given a lot of thrust, but today probably that thrust is not required. With the help of the technology, with a reasonable number of branches also, the banking can be made available to the people in all parts of the country.
Sure. Quick closing comment from my panelists here in the studio. Ms. Kohli, starting with you, of course, can NPAs be completely eliminated?
See, certain amount of bad loans will always be there in the system. Firms will fail. I mean, that's the whole idea underlying entrepreneurship. You succeed or you fail, and there are always probabilities depending on the business. So some level of NPAs will always be there. They shouldn't reach such a crisis proportion that they constrain the banking system and they weigh down the firms. All I want to say is that banks are very important in the Indian economy, whether you like it or not. Practically all the financing of economic activity comes from the banks. There's no other source of financing, particularly the public sector banks. They are the only ones who finance lower than AAA rated large firms and small firms as well as medium firms.
Right.
So you have to look after them. Sure,
you have to look after them. And Mr. Dua, quick closing comments from you, because I'm very limited time at the moment.
Going forward, we have to accept the position that the world is moving into a scenario where there will be considerable volatility on the economic front. There would be bad loans, but it does not mean that every bad loan must result in a police investigation and the I wouldn't call it prosecution, even persecution of somebody who's taken the decisions or so. Having accepted that position, we have to work towards professionalizing and making transparent all these lending operations, rather than being kept just in the hands of a few, and that is where a regulator's role comes in extremely important. And I would see only the Reserve Bank of India being the effective regulator rather than the government per se.
Sure. I'm completely out of time on the program, so I'd have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. At that, Renu Kohli, TK Arun, Ajay Dua and US Bhargava, thank you so much for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have. Thank you for watching.